Hello, my name's Pauline Basilio. I'm the Manager of Health Information Services and also the Privacy Officer for the organisation. To be talking to you today about privacy and confidentiality and what that means for us here at Ballarat Health Services. So firstly, just starting off with some examples of what a privacy breach is in the context of our hospital. One of the most important ones would be non-work related access to clinical information systems such as our IBA system or BOSNet medical record. So an example would be perhaps checking your own test results or that of a family member. That's what we mean by non-work related. It's for a personal reason. It's not related to your role or your task. Another example of a privacy breach would be the loss of confidential information. We unfortunately have a number of episodes of this. It's quite frequent whereby a clinical handover list might be dropped in the streets around the hospital. In fact, I was walking back from the QE on Friday and found exactly that on the pathway in Ascot Street. So unfortunately, people walk between our campuses or around the hospital and they drop these things. So it's not done deliberately, but it's certainly a point of vulnerability for us. Another example, emailing confidential information to the wrong email address. Now, at the moment, we very much discourage, it's actually against policy to email confidential information, but occasionally people do that or they do it commonly, but it can go wrong. So sending it to the wrong person is definitely a privacy breach. And then things like verbal discussion of confidential information in a public place or exposure of confidential information in a public place, such as having a clinical meeting in one of the cafes around the hospital, for example. That is a privacy breach or a breach of privacy because you don't know who's on the next table. So there's some examples of privacy breaches that do happen, unfortunately, with some frequency. In terms of the impact of those privacy breaches, hopefully that would be fairly obvious to most of us, but these privacy breaches have the potential to cause distress to the patient and the patient's family, and that has definitely occurred. And that's where the privacy and clinical practice intersect, because this can cause real distress to patient and their families. Obviously, a loss of trust from our consumers and our community. Our community need to trust us to do the right thing with their information. And when we breach privacy, that's not a good look for us. It is a breach of legislation, so quite serious, and can also result in disciplinary action or professional sanctions if it was something that was proven to be malicious or intentional, that could be reported to your professional board if relevant. And lastly, loss of reputation for the hospital. These privacy breaches can end up on the front page of the local paper or the media, social media and all of that. So loss of reputation and adverse publicity is definitely a consideration. So just in terms of understanding our obligation to protect patient privacy, the Health Records Act is our primary piece of legislation that governs our obligation as a public health agency and as a public hospital. The Health Services Act is also very key in that it has a very clear message of confidentiality in Section 141, that we may not divulge confidential information with anybody, information about a patient. There are a number of exemptions, both in the Health Services Act and the Health Records Act, but primarily we should not discuss private patient information with anybody else. And I'll go through some of the principles in a moment. You don't need to necessarily know the legislation because we distill those privacy principles into our BHS privacy policy. So I'd encourage you very much to have a look at that. It's not a difficult read, it's only a couple of pages and I think it's quite succinct. Another layer of obligation, particularly for clinical staff at BHS, is your professional code of conduct, both medical, nursing and allied health. All of those codes of conduct have privacy clauses in them. So as a professional, you are obliged to protect your patient's privacy as well. And I think the last layer of obligation for all of us, clinical and non-clinical, is that of our moral and ethical obligation as employees of this hospital and as members of our community to protect the information that we come into contact with as part of our daily work. And that's something I think when we are patients, we would expect from our carers as well. Related to the Health Records Act, what is health information and why does the Health Records Act apply to this hospital? So any personal information collected by a healthcare provider, which is us, is health information. So fairly obviously that covers what you would expect to be health information, so patient information, their identifying information, their demographics, their billing information, and indeed their medical and clinical information. But equally, because we are a hospital, personal information that we capture is considered health information. That also includes information about us as staff. So our HR files, for example, and our payroll information is considered health information and therefore under the Health Records Act. In terms of what confidential information is anything that can identify an individual. So that can be a small piece of information or it can be a whole medical record and all of the detail that is within that. So the volume of information doesn't matter, it's whatever can identify an individual. Equally and importantly, in a regional setting such as ours, the community is smaller. So when we talk about information that can identify a person, it doesn't have to be the name. So you can be talking about a person, not include their name, or a written piece of information may have had the name removed, but from the information, from the circumstances, you can still potentially identify that individual. So de-identification by removing name is not necessarily adequate in our context as a regional hospital, so it's really important to understand. So further on the Health Records Act, the privacy principles are the mainstay of that Act, and there are 11 of them, but I won't go through all 11. There's probably 6 that are the most important. The first of those is collection. So we should only collect information that we need. We don't just collect it for the fun of it. We collect it with a purpose, and we collect it with a purpose of delivering healthcare to the patient and running our hospital. Importantly, we must only use and disclose that information and access it for the purpose for which we collect it. So for delivering healthcare to that patient. And that's where we translate the standard statement in our privacy policy that you must only access, use and disclose confidential information for a work-related purpose. So if it's not related to your work, if it's not related to the task you're doing or to the patient that you're caring for, then you do not access that information and you certainly do not disclose it. So for me, that's really quite black and white. It's either work-related or it's not. So accessing confidential information for a personal reason is definitely a breach of privacy. HPP, Health Privacy Principle 3, obliges us to make sure the information we collect is accurate. And that's a bit of a no-brainer, sorry, but it is in the Health Records Act. Information that is inaccurate can potentially breach someone's privacy. For example, if information about another patient is mixed up in someone else's record, then it is actually a breach of privacy as well. Openness, which is HPP 5 and 6, openness, we must inform our patients and anyone indeed that we collect information from why we're doing it. So what we're collecting, why we're collecting it, what we do with it, and how we store it and how we protect it. And we achieve that for patient information through our privacy brochure, which is available to patients. That brochure also informs patients that they may access, they have a right of access to their health information, and they have a right to request correction of that information if they believe that it is inaccurate. And we also manage that under the Freedom of Information Act as well. The last of the health privacy principles that I'll reference is number 4, which is protection. It's actually called data security, but for me it's encapsulated in the word protection. We need to protect the information that is in our care, and we need to protect it from loss, destruction, unauthorised access, unauthorised disclosure, and misuse. So that's all of our obligations. That's my obligation as privacy officer, but it's everybody's obligation. Anyone that comes into contact with confidential information or handles it or has access to it must understand that obligation. So the do's and don'ts of privacy, what does this mean? How do we apply all this theory? What we do need to do, as I just said, is protect patient privacy. It's really, really important, and that's the guts of what I'm talking about here. So to repeat myself, we only use, access and disclose information for a valid work-related purpose, for no other purpose, and definitely never personal purposes. We need to make sure that when we carry loose confidential information like handover lists and clinical lists, which clinicians do every day, it's really, really important for those people to have that information on their person, but you must take personal responsibility for those and keep them secure, dispose of them in the confidential bins when their use-by date's up, and definitely make sure that you do not lose them or expose them to the public. Again, one of the do's is to de-identify patient information, and remembering that removal of the name is not necessarily enough. So if you're a student and you're doing case studies, or if you're an educator and you're presenting something to a group, you need to make sure that the subject of that case study or that presentation cannot necessarily be identified outside. In terms of clinical presentation, if you're presenting to a team that's cared for that patient, obviously they will probably know that patient. But certainly if you're presenting to a wider group that doesn't know the patient, they should not be able to be identified. You know, a common slip-up is where someone might put up on the screen a radiology image, and you think that radiology images are not identified, but they are. The patient's name is down in the bottom left-hand corner or whatever. So just things like that. So the do nots: don't take confidential information home or to cafes. Leave it on site, in a secure location on site. Do not share your passwords and logons, particularly our clinical system, but any system. And that's really important from a cybersecurity angle, and we'll talk briefly about that at the end. But if you leave your session logged on and you move away from a computer and someone else accesses information that they shouldn't have access to, or do something malicious on your session, ultimately that's your responsibility. And the other thing, I guess, is that if you leave confidential information on a screen open to anyone to have a look at and you move away, to me that's just disrespectful. Okay, so a lot of privacy is also about respect, and common sense for that matter. Don't save confidential information to a USB, which for the most part you can't now because USB ports have been disabled for cybersecurity reasons. But we used to find that in the past that people would have saved confidential information onto a USB, and then we would find those USBs in meeting rooms or left in computers or even dropped in the car park, for example. The ward and library desktops, you mustn't save confidential information onto those either. The library desktops are open to the public, so it is certainly not a secure location. So confidential information that needs to be stored needs to be done in the right location, and that's on your department's S drive. Do not access your own record or records or information relating to your friends, families or colleagues. People often mistake your own record. People think that, well, I have access and it's my record, it's my information, therefore I can access it. But when you access your own medical record as a clinician using your clinical credentials or your staff credentials, you are doing so for personal reasons. So you're actually breaching both legislation and our policy. If you are a patient here and you want to access your information, then you do it via the same methods as any other patient, not via your staff access. And I'll go through those in a moment. And it's even more important not to abuse the trust of your friends, family and colleagues by perhaps giving in to curiosity and checking someone's test results or reading their information. And it doesn't matter if that person is your child, so they're a minor, you're a parent and you think you've got the right of access, or if it's your partner and you think that person would give you permission, or if that person has even asked you to do it. It's all a breach of privacy, and it's all a breach of policy and legislation. And we have also had an instance where staff have accessed the medical records of colleagues, which is probably the worst case scenario, and that is completely forbidden. I guess is the best word. Emailing, I'll talk a little bit more about it in a minute, and photographing documents or wounds, or you're doing clinical photography on your own personal mobile is also not permitted. That is a breach of privacy as well. Although occasionally, sometimes we don't have any other device, but it's certainly our recommendation is that you use a hospital camera for that purpose. You do not want images of other people's body parts or information on your personal mobile. That is a very, very risky thing to do. Social media. We continue to have a few issues with social media. People often blur the lines between their personal and professional life. But the rule of thumb here is that if you have information that you have come across that is in your head from working in this hospital, you must not share it via social media, verbal means, or any other means. That is not your information to share. So there are policies galore. BHS has a social media policy. The AMA has a social media policy, the ANMF, etc., and APRA do as well. So there's certainly many to choose from. They all have about 4 common points. That professional standards and privacy principles apply within your clinical context here or your work context here. They apply equally outside of the workspace to the information that is in your head. Posts should never contain information that identifies a patient, their health condition or treatment. Staff must not friend former or current patients. That's more of a guidance from professional bodies than a privacy issue, just because these things can actually go pear-shaped. And fairly obviously, don't bag out your manager or your colleagues on social media, because someone will see it and dob you in. So do have a look at the social media policies. They are really, really important to cement. And the one that's visible on the slide is the one from the AMA, and that actually has real life examples where clinicians have got themselves into trouble in the context of social media. So those real life examples really illustrate how you can get it wrong. Best advice I can give is to keep your professional and your personal spaces very, very separate, and don't blur the two on social media. Just moving on now to release or disclosure of information. We have a protocol that was designed just for clinicians being asked for release of information, CPP 0632. That came about from an example which I can refer to because it's been in the media about 18 months ago, whereby the wrong information was given to a family member on the phone, and that family member was told their loved one was deceased when in fact that wasn't. The clinician was talking about a different person. So obviously that caused a great deal of distress to the patient's family. It was a genuine error. There was no misintention there, but there are a number of principles that we need to observe when we're releasing information, and particularly when you're doing that on the phone, when you're talking to family members and others that are inquiring about patients. So firstly, check the identity of the patient. Make sure that the person on the phone is asking about is the same one that you're talking about. So check identity first. Check the identity of the requester. Just because someone rings up and requests information, or stands in front of you and requests information, emails you, whatever, doesn't mean that person has a right to that information. So you need to know who they are and whether they have a right to the information. Those are the sort of next two principles. So check the identity of the requester and their right to the information. Once you've established those 3 things and you think that it's safe to release information, make sure that you're the appropriate person to do that. Is it, or should it be someone of greater seniority than you? Or if you're, say, the ward clerk on the ward, and the information may be better given by a clinician. And lastly, and most importantly, if you don't feel comfortable, if in doubt, don't release it. Escalate that to your manager. Once information's released, you can't get it back. You can always say to the person, I'm not sure if I can release that information to you, let me check and we'll come back to you. Okay, so make sure first. Health Privacy Principle 6, the patient's right to information. Patients do have a right to access their information. There are 3 main methods for this. It can be during a clinical episode. So if a patient asks for a copy of a document whilst they're an inpatient, or at the end of their stay they ask for a copy of their discharge summary because they live in Queensland and they want to take it to their GP, that's absolutely fine. We certainly don't hand over whole copies of medical records at that point because it's not practical to do so. But if the treating clinician is happy for a copy of a document to be provided, then that is fine. Alternatively, we can send information to another healthcare provider. So if a patient rings us up and says, I'm going to see a specialist next week, could you send this information to that specialist? Yes, we can do that, and in fact we're obliged to do that under the Health Records Act. That's Health Privacy Principle number 11. And the last one is via freedom of information, and this is used where the patient may want a copy of their whole medical record, which may be quite large, or they're doing it in retrospect. They're not in their current clinical scenario. Maybe they haven't been seen for a year, but they ring up and they want their record for a particular purpose. Then we go through the Freedom of Information Act. So lastly, moving on to cybersecurity. In terms of the way we manage information now, it's largely electronic. So the old days of paper medical records are disappearing. We still have them, but we manage our clinical and personal health information largely via electronic means. And because of that, privacy and data security are very much 2 sides of the same coin. They're impossible to separate. So when we talk about privacy, we're also talking about the security, data security. So HPPs, the Health Privacy Principles, apply to health information and personal information no matter what medium that information is stored in. So whether it be paper, whether it be electronic, whether it be in fact a verbal, it all applies equally. Where things get tricky with the electronic information, on one hand it's more secure because it's password protected. It's, you have to log in to access it, but it is vulnerable in terms of cybersecurity. The malicious, the malware attacks, the cyber attacks. We are vulnerable in terms of the sophistication of those and the way those people with malicious intent can actually get into our systems because they're very sophisticated. So be aware of phishing. That's phishing with a PH, where people send you emails that look like the real deal and they tell you to hand over your credentials or they tell you to click on the link. Some of them look really kosher. You really just need to be very, very vigilant at all times because that's the primary way that cyber attacks happen. That's how they get in. So be vigilant, be suspicious. If it doesn't look right, don't click on it. There can actually be consequences to clinical care. Medical records have been held for ransom. Hospitals have been out for 2 weeks without their systems. And if you think about the reliance we have on our electronic systems these days, we can't even tell which patients are coming in tomorrow without our systems. We can't identify if we have a patient record without looking that patient up on the computer. So if we're to manage without a computer systems, it's going to be a very, very difficult thing to do indeed. So the best way to manage it is to not let these guys in the first place. So please be aware of the very, very close relationship between privacy and cybersecurity. And that, again, like privacy, cybersecurity is all of our responsibility. It only takes one mishap, one person to click on the wrong thing to bring us down. So it's really, really important. Okay, so that's pretty much it. I'll just close up by reminding you that, once again, I am the Privacy Officer for Ballarat Health Services. Something that our privacy education does inform us that not everybody's aware we have such a person, so just advertising that I'm it. I'm available at any time for privacy questions. Those can equally be put to your manager and they can be sent to me, can be contacted directly, or they can come to me via your manager. Thank you.